When Jimmy Page finally broke his silence about Ritchie Blackmore, the world of rock music stopped and listened. For decades, fans of both Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple had speculated on the hidden truths behind their relationship. Were they rivals, admirers, or something more complicated? Now, after years of myth and mystery, Jimmy Page has revealed a perspective that reshapes how we understand two of the greatest guitarists in rock history. But before we get to that revelation, we must go back to the very beginning, to understand the man behind the legend and the circumstances that shaped his destiny. James Patrick Page was born on January 9, 1944, in the West London suburb of Heston, Middlesex, England. The son of James Page, an industrial personnel manager, and Patricia Elizabeth Gaffigan, a doctor's secretary, young Jimmy was raised in a modest household during the final months of the Second World War. England was still reeling from the devastation of the Blitz, and his earliest years were defined by rationing, rebuilding, and a cultural climate that longed for escape and inspiration. Music was not immediately in his bloodline, but it would become the lifeline through which he expressed himself. The Page family moved to Epsom, Surrey, when Jimmy was still a child, and it was here that his first brushes with the guitar took place. Around the age of 12, he stumbled upon an old Spanish guitar that had been left behind in the house they moved into. It was a discovery that would alter the course of his life forever. Jimmy's early education was typical of a suburban boy in post-war Britain, but he quickly began to show signs of prodigious musical ability. He would sit in his room for hours, carefully plucking at the strings, teaching himself chords from a worn instructional book. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Jimmy was not initially trained through formal lessons. Instead, he was part of a generation of musicians who absorbed influences from the rapidly spreading sounds of American blues and rock and roll. He was particularly captivated by the recordings of Elvis Presley, Scotty Moore, and later, bluesmen like Muddy Waters, B.B. King, and Howlin' Wolf. Their raw energy and soulful expression spoke directly to the young English boy's spirit. By his teenage years, he had become proficient enough to start performing at local youth clubs and school dances. But it wasn't just his musical ability that stood out, it was his drive. Jimmy was intensely focused, a perfectionist even in his youth, constantly striving to unlock new techniques on the guitar. He enrolled at Sutton Art College, intending to pursue a career as a visual artist. But the guitar soon overshadowed every other passion. The classroom gave way to practice sessions, and Jimmy's artistic creativity found its truest expression through music. By the age of 15, Jimmy had already begun playing semi-professionally. He joined a skiffle group, a popular British music style at the time that blended jazz, folk, and blues. Soon after, he was recruited into various local bands, honing his craft and experimenting with the electric guitar's possibilities. His reputation grew quickly within London's burgeoning music scene. One pivotal moment came when Jimmy appeared on the British television talent show All Your Own, which showcased young performers. With his guitar in hand, the teenage Page displayed both poise and technical skill that belied his age. This television appearance gave him his first taste of national exposure, hinting at the star he would one day become. As he moved deeper into the world of professional musicianship, Jimmy faced both inspiration and intimidation from the rapidly expanding rock scene. He admired fellow guitarists like Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck, who, like him, were pushing the boundaries of electric guitar. Yet, even in these formative years, Jimmy had something unique: an instinctive sense of arrangement, an ear for layering sound, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. These qualities would later define him not only as a guitarist, but as a visionary producer. By the early 1960s, Jimmy Page was already a sought-after session musician, playing anonymously on countless records that would fill the British charts. But before he could rise to international stardom with Led Zeppelin, he was still a young man searching for his place in the world. It was during these years that he began to cross paths directly and indirectly, with another ambitious guitarist who was carving his own legend, Ritchie Blackmore. The seeds of both rivalry and mutual respect were being planted, though neither man could have guessed how their names would become eternally linked in the mythology of rock. By the early 1960s, Jimmy Page had already proven himself as one of the most promising guitarists in Britain. But before the world would know him as the driving force behind Led Zeppelin, he spent years laboring behind the curtain of the music industry, perfecting his craft as a session musician. It was a period of intense work, long hours, and little recognition. Yet, it shaped him into one of the most versatile and innovative guitarists of his generation. London at the time was exploding with new musical talent. The British invasion was brewing, with groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones preparing to dominate the airwaves. Record producers were desperate for reliable musicians who could come into a studio, sight read or improvise, and deliver flawless takes. Jimmy was exactly that. His reputation grew so strong that he became one of the busiest session players in Britain. From the early 1960s onward, Jimmy played guitar on hundreds of recordings, often uncredited. His work appeared on tracks for artists such as The Who, The Kinks, Donovan, Petula Clark, and even Tom Jones. Many listeners didn't realize that the distinctive riffs and flourishes on their favorite singles often came from this quiet, young man who rarely sought the spotlight. Yet Jimmy wasn't fully satisfied with the anonymity of studio work. While it provided steady income and honed his versatility, he longed for the raw energy and creative freedom of live performance. In 1965, he was offered the chance to join the Yardbirds, one of the era's most adventurous blues rock bands. At first he hesitated, but soon the pull of the stage became irresistible. He accepted, initially sharing guitar duties with Jeff Beck. The partnership between Beck and Page was explosive. Their dual guitar lineup produced a thunderous, experimental sound that was ahead of its time. Audiences were enthralled by their chemistry, but behind the scenes, tensions ran high. Beck eventually left the band, leaving Jimmy as the sole guitarist. Under his leadership, the Yardbirds experimented with heavier riffs and longer improvisations, foreshadowing the birth of hard rock and heavy metal. By 1968, however, the Yardbirds were unraveling. Band members drifted away, and Jimmy was left with a contractual obligation to fulfill a tour under the group's name. Rather than give up, he saw an opportunity. He assembled a new lineup, recruiting Robert Plant as vocalist, John Paul Jones on bass and keyboards, and John Bonham on drums. Together, they became the new Yardbirds, though this name was quickly abandoned for something more powerful: Led Zeppelin. Their debut album, Led Zeppelin, 1969, was nothing short of a revelation. It fused blues, folk, and hard rock into a ferocious soundscape that was both primal and sophisticated. Tracks like Dazed and Confused and Communication Breakdown showcased Jimmy's innovative use of distortion, feedback, and the violin bow on his guitar. The album stormed the charts, establishing the band as a dominant force almost overnight. What set Jimmy apart from many of his contemporaries, including Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple, was his dual role as both guitarist and producer. He wasn't just writing riffs, he was crafting entire sonic worlds in the studio. His obsessive layering of guitars, his manipulation of recording techniques, and his ear for dynamics turned Zeppelin's albums into groundbreaking works of art. The band's second album, Led Zeppelin II, released later in 1969, cemented their place in history. With its iconic opening riff on Whole Lotta Love, Jimmy delivered one of rock's most enduring guitar anthems. The record sold millions and demonstrated that Led Zeppelin was not a passing fad, but a new standard-bearer for hard rock. As the 1970s began, Jimmy's stature grew with each release. Led Zeppelin III introduced acoustic textures, while Led Zeppelin IV, 1971, featured the immortal Stairway to Heaven. a song that combined delicate folk melodies with one of the most celebrated guitar solos of all time. By then, Jimmy was hailed as a guitar god, though he carried the title with quiet intensity rather than brash arrogance. Yet the rise to stardom was not without its challenges. The relentless touring schedule took a toll on the band. Rumors of excess, tension, and creative clashes began to swirl. Jimmy himself, always intensely private, struggled with the pressures of fame. Still, his vision never faltered. With albums like Physical Graffiti and Houses of the Holy, he continued to push boundaries, solidifying Zeppelin's place in the pantheon of rock legends. It was during this same era that Ritchie Blackmore and Deep Purple were also carving their place in rock history. Both men were redefining what the electric guitar could do, but their approaches were distinct. Page was a master of atmosphere and layering, while Blackmore leaned heavily into classical influences and razor-sharp precision. Inevitably, fans and critics compared the two, fueling speculation about rivalry. For Jimmy, however, the focus remained on the music. He was not one to openly disparage his peers, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But as Led Zeppelin's fame soared, whispers about his true feelings toward Blackmore persisted, waiting for the day he would finally reveal the truth. Behind the towering riffs and the mythic stage presence, Jimmy Page lived a private and complex personal life. While the public knew him as the guitar sorcerer of Led Zeppelin, his relationships, marriages, and romances revealed a man constantly pulled between devotion to music and the search for personal connection. Jimmy's first serious relationship unfolded during the height of the 1960s, when he was balancing the demands of session work and his transition into the Yardbirds. Known for his quiet charm and intellectual curiosity, Jimmy attracted partners who were drawn not just to his fame, but to his aura of mystery. Yet intimacy often clashed with his single-minded pursuit of music. In 1970, Jimmy married Charlotte Martin, a French model who had been part of London's bohemian scene. Their union represented a rare moment of stability in his otherwise turbulent life. The couple welcomed a daughter, Scarlett Page, in 1971. Scarlett would later pursue a career in photography, carving out her own creative path while carrying the legacy of her famous surname. But despite their love, Jimmy and Charlotte's marriage faced strain from the band's grueling schedule and the temptations of life on the road. By the early 1980s, their relationship had unraveled, and they quietly separated. Scarlett remained a constant in Jimmy's life, and he has often spoken with pride about her accomplishments. For a man so immersed in the mythology of rock and roll, his relationship with his daughter offered a grounding force, a reminder of life beyond the spotlight. Jimmy's romantic life after Charlotte included several notable relationships. In the mid-1970s, he became involved with Lori Maddox, a young model who was part of the Los Angeles groupie scene. Their relationship, controversial due to her age at the time, has since been the subject of scrutiny and debate, reflecting the blurred boundaries of fame, power, and responsibility in rock's excess-driven era. He also shared a significant bond with Baby Buell, the model and singer who was famously connected to other rock icons such as Todd Rundgren and Steven Tyler. Their romance was brief but intense, emblematic of the whirlwind relationships that often surrounded musicians of Zeppelin's stature. Later in life, Jimmy found steadier companionship. He entered into a long-term relationship with Jimena Gomez Paracha, an Argentine-born woman he met while working with a children's charity in Brazil in the 1990s. They married in 1995 and together raised 3 children, 2 of whom Jimmy adopted from Jimena's previous relationship. Their marriage lasted nearly a decade before ending in divorce in 2008, but Jimmy remained committed to the children and the family they had built together. What stands out across Jimmy's personal history is the duality between the man on stage and the man at home. On stage, he was commanding, enigmatic, even mystical. At home, he was known to be gentle, soft-spoken and deeply reflective. Friends and family often described him as a man of contradictions, disciplined in his art, yet prone to the indulgences that came with fame, fiercely private, yet eternally in the public eye. Romantically, Jimmy's life also paralleled the larger-than-life nature of the rock world. His relationships often played out against the backdrop of endless touring, extravagant parties, and the intoxicating allure of stardom. Yet, unlike some of his contemporaries, he seldom flaunted these affairs publicly. He guarded his privacy, preferring mystery over tabloid attention. As the years passed, his focus shifted more toward family and legacy. He cultivated close relationships with his children, not only Scarlett but also those he raised with Jimena. While he never became the archetypal family man in the traditional sense, his later life revealed a softer, more nurturing side that contrasted with the dark, almost mythical image he carried in the 1970s. Throughout it all, there was always a shadow of comparison, whether intended or not, to contemporaries like Ritchie Blackmore, whose own personal life was also marked by turbulent romances and dramatic shifts. Both men seemed to live under the burden of genius, struggling to balance personal happiness with the demands of their art. For Jimmy Page, love was often elusive, yet it remained an essential part of his story. His marriages, romances, and children reflected the human side of a man often deified for his music. These relationships remind us that behind the magic of Stairway to Heaven, behind the otherworldly solos and mystique, there was simply Jimmy, searching for connection, meaning, and love, just like anyone else. As his personal life evolved, the speculation about his professional rivalries and hidden truths only grew louder. Fans and journalists alike wondered, what did Jimmy Page really think of his peers, particularly the mercurial Ritchie Blackmore? For decades he stayed silent, but eventually, the time came when he would open up, and the world would finally hear his truth. For decades, fans of classic rock debated one burning question. What did Jimmy Page truly think of Ritchie Blackmore? Both men were masters of their craft, architects of hard rock and early heavy metal, and leaders of two of the greatest bands in history, Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple. Comparisons were inevitable. Music magazines in the 1970s ran countless features pitting Page against Blackmore, and fans argued endlessly over which guitarist reigned supreme. Yet Page himself remained almost entirely silent, offering little more than polite deflections. Until now. Now, for the first time, Jimmy revealed in a rare interview, I can say how much respect I've always had for Ritchie. He was fearless. We didn't always move in the same circles, but I listened closely to what he was doing, and I admired it. The world was stunned. For years, the narrative had been one of rivalry, two guitar wizards battling for dominance on the same stage of history. But Jimmy's confession painted a different picture. Not rivalry, but mutual recognition. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple often crossed paths. They shared festival lineups, toured through the same venues, and even stayed in some of the same hotels while crisscrossing Europe and America. Rumors abounded, of tense encounters, of glares exchanged backstage, of egos colliding in smoky dressing rooms. But according to Page, the truth was far more nuanced. We were both perfectionists, Jimmy explained. Ritchie had this incredible classical approach. His phrasing was razor-sharp, and he had a real sense of drama. I was more into layering, textures, and improvisation. We were on parallel roads, different styles, but heading to the same destination. Fans often perceived Blackmore as the darker, moodier figure, while Page was the mystical architect. Yet in reality, both men shared a similar devotion to pushing the boundaries of what the electric guitar could achieve. Blackmore's neoclassical flourishes on songs like Highway Star and Child in Time resonated with Page, just as Zeppelin's sprawling epics inspired admiration from Blackmore. Behind the scenes, the two did meet, though not often. On one occasion, in the early 1970s, after a festival performance, Jimmy and Ritchie reportedly sat together long into the night, trading stories and ideas. "We weren't competitors in that moment," Jimmy recalled. "We were just two musicians, fascinated by what the guitar could do." The reason Jimmy stayed silent for so long, he explained, was partly out of respect for the myth-making that surrounded both bands. The press loved to stir it up. Rivalries sell magazines, but I never felt it was a fight. There was no need to come out and say, "Oh, I like Ritchie," or "I don't like him." It wasn't about that. It was about the music. Still, Jimmy acknowledged the competitive energy that did exist. Of course, when you heard something brilliant from someone like Ritchie, it pushed you to dig deeper yourself. That's the beauty of it. We inspired each other, even if we didn't say it out loud. In fact, Jimmy revealed that there were moments when he almost collaborated with Blackmore. There was talk, very informal, about maybe doing something together, just to see where it would go. But we were both so consumed by our own bands. Led Zeppelin was a full-time universe, and so was Deep Purple. It never happened, but I think it would have been fascinating. That revelation alone sent shockwaves through the rock community. The thought of Page and Blackmore side by side, trading riffs, remains one of music's great what-ifs. When pressed further about his true feelings toward his supposed rival, Jimmy grew reflective. "People forget that we were all part of the same generation, the same movement. We were kids in post-war Britain who fell in love with American blues and turned it into something of our own. Ritchie and I just expressed it differently, but the foundation was the same." He paused, then added words that silenced years of speculation. "I never saw Ritchie as a rival. I saw him as a fellow traveler. We were both carving out new territory. If anything, I think we pushed each other further than we might have gone alone. And that's something I'll always be grateful for." With those words, the myth of enmity dissolved into something richer: mutual respect, admiration, and a recognition that two giants had shaped rock not in opposition, but in harmony, even if unspoken. After decades of whispers, Jimmy Page's revelation not only redefined his relationship with Ritchie Blackmore, but also reminded the world of something essential. Great art is not born of rivalry alone, but from the unseen threads of influence, inspiration, and shared passion. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, Jimmy Page had already secured his place among the greatest guitarists of all time. Yet his later years would prove both challenging and illuminating. A journey of loss, reinvention, and ultimately, enduring legacy. The first major turning point came in 1980, with the sudden death of drummer John Bonham. It was a devastating blow. For Jimmy, Led Zeppelin had always been more than a band. It was a brotherhood, a collective force greater than its parts. When Bonham passed away at just 32, the band chose to disband rather than continue without him. For Jimmy, the grief was profound. He withdrew from the public eye, struggling with the loss of his friend and the identity he had built through Zeppelin. The 1980s saw Jimmy navigating uneven terrain. He contributed to projects such as The Firm, a supergroup with Paul Rodgers, and collaborated with musicians like David Coverdale, and even reunited briefly with Robert Plant for the Page and Plant project. These ventures allowed him to explore new sounds, though none ever reached the seismic heights of Led Zeppelin. Still, Jimmy's guitar work remained unmistakable, haunting, layered, and endlessly inventive. In his personal life, he continued to balance family and music. His marriage to Jimena Gomez Paracha in the 1990s brought a new sense of grounding, particularly as he raised his children. Jimmy also became increasingly dedicated to philanthropy, supporting a variety of charities, particularly those aimed at children and education. This quieter side of his life contrasted with the chaotic excesses of Zeppelin's heyday, reflecting a man who had weathered storms and emerged reflective. Yet Jimmy never stopped being a guardian of the Zeppelin legacy. He oversaw remasters of the band's catalog, curated live recordings, and ensured that the mythology of Led Zeppelin remained alive for new generations. His meticulous care for the music mirrored the precision with which he had always approached his art. Fans marveled not only at the albums themselves, but at how fresh and powerful they sounded decades later, thanks to Jimmy's attention to detail. Though rumors of a full Led Zeppelin reunion have persisted for years, Page has consistently stressed that the magic of Zeppelin was tied to its original chemistry, something that could never truly be recreated. The band did reunite for a historic performance at London's O2 Arena in 2007, with Bonham's son, Jason Bonham, on drums. The show was hailed as a triumph, a reminder of the colossal force Zeppelin once commanded. For Jimmy, it was both a celebration and a farewell. As the years passed, his legend only grew. Guitarists across genres, from metal shredders to indie rock players, cited him as a foundational influence. His techniques, using the bow, layering multiple guitar parts, experimenting with tuning, became staples of modern rock. Beyond the mechanics, however, Jimmy's music embodied something harder to define: mystery, atmosphere, and a sense of journey. When asked about legacy, Jimmy has always been humble, preferring to let the music speak. But his recent words about Ritchie Blackmore offered a window into how he views himself within the pantheon of rock's greats. By acknowledging Blackmore as a peer rather than a rival, Jimmy positioned himself not as a solitary titan, but as part of a generation of innovators who collectively transformed music. It's a sentiment that resonates with fans today. The so-called guitar gods of the 1960s and 1970s were not isolated figures. They were part of a dialogue, each pushing the other forward, whether through admiration, competition, or sheer inspiration. Jimmy Page's final truth about Ritchie Blackmore confirmed what many suspected: that greatness is rarely born in isolation. It thrives in connection. Now, in his later years, Jimmy lives a quieter life, often retreating into his home in England, where he still plays guitar daily. He continues to give interviews selectively, carefully preserving the mystique that has always surrounded him. And when he does speak, the world listens. Jimmy Page's story is not merely one of riffs and records. It is the story of a boy from post-war England who picked up an old guitar and changed music forever. It is the story of a man who navigated fame, tragedy, and reinvention, all while keeping his artistry intact. And most recently, it is the story of someone who, after decades of silence, chose to honor a fellow legend, reminding us all that respect and admiration outlast rivalry. In the end, Jimmy Page leaves us with more than just songs. He leaves us with a legacy of vision, innovation, and humility. His music remains a stairway to another world, a place where sound becomes myth, and myth becomes timeless. And now, with his words about Ritchie Blackmore, he has given us one more truth: a reminder that even giants can walk the same path together.